Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to let people come in, and then Jan and I will get started. Hey, everybody, we're just going to give it another minute or two, and we'll get going. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So we are going to be talking today about open science fundamentals. And if you're wondering what that is, hopefully we have lots of good answers to that question.
All right, so hi everyone also from my end. My name is Jan Voelkel. I'm a PhD student in Stanford Sociology Department, and I'm affiliated on a few projects with the SSNL lab. Very excited to talk today about one of the things that I care most about in science, namely open science.
Yeah, awesome. And if you came to our programming and statistics workshop a couple of weeks ago, we might have met there, but my name's Ian. I manage Jamil Zaki's lab in the psych department.
Yeah, so before we get started with our presentation today, I would like to just pose the question for you for a few seconds to think about, namely how is the scientific method for acquiring, generating, accumulating knowledge special, or how is it defined, how is it different from other ways of accessing or generating knowledge. For example, in newspapers articles written by journalists or religions. How's the scientific method special in generating knowledge? Because that is going to be a cornerstone of the presentation today. So I would just let that sit with you for a few seconds and then give my own take. All right, so my own take, which is very much the open science take on this, is that science should generate and accumulate knowledge that is A, replicable, B, reproducible, and C, accessible. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive. There are a lot of other things that science is supposed to do and should do. And I'm also not saying that everyone agrees with me or Ian on these questions. There are a lot of different science philosophies, but we want to make the point today that all of these things are crucial to a science that matters not only to researchers, but also to members of the public who hope to learn from scientific insights. And so we will talk about these three principles one at a time, why it is important, how it has gone wrong in the past, and what we and you as young aspiring researchers who may in the future end up not only consuming knowledge but also generating knowledge can do in order to fulfill these important principles. Okay, let's get started with the first one. Replicability. Replicability is the very basic idea that when someone else has run a study, you can run the same study again with a new set of data and would find the same effects that have been identified earlier. So this is a cornerstone of science, right? Because if we're not able to replicate, to find the same findings again, how can we really build on earlier knowledge? And this is replication has always been recognized by scientific philosophers, by methodologists as a very important part of science. Yet, empirically, if you look at how often replication studies have really been conducted, it hasn't been until recently that this topic has received a lot of attention. So we will now go through some of the ways that this like interest in replicability and the controversies about replicability have been triggered. And we will start with like maybe the most controversial study in social psychology, at least for the last few decades. Okay, Ian, do you want to? Yeah. So in 2011, Daryl Bam, psychology professor at Cornell University, published a paper in the field's most prominent and like supposed to be most rigorous journal that only publishes the like best articles in the field. For those of you who already have some experience, you may have submitted an article to JPSP, and maybe got rejected. I've gotten a few rejections from JPSP. It's usually quite difficult to get in there. You usually need like a lot of studies with which you signal that like your study is like a very consistent and reliable study. And in 2011, Daryl Bam did that. He cleared all of the bars for this like impressive looking paper that he has on feeling the future. Evidence that people can predict the future, cannot just predict, but feel the future. Yeah, and this was one of the moments where science got a lot of attention in the news as well. And we will take a look at one of the ways that this was covered, which will also give you some more insights into what the paper actually showed by looking at a video from the Colbert Report. Can we put this on?
We can. Let's see. I believe in us.
Does this censure feel like a compromise to you? Watch this.
We want to start ideally at one minute in, going to 250.
Sorry, we're going to Nissan.
Why should you?
The all-new Nissan Sentra.
Let's do a little test right now. Everyone is $5 each to sit in front of a computer screen which displayed two curtains. They were told an image would appear behind one of the curtains and asked to predict which one. It's just like your grandfather's old game, which hand is hiding the quarter, except in this case, grandpa gets tenure. When the image was neutral, subjects were able to predict which side it would appear on 49.8% of the time. Statistically random. But when the images about to be revealed were erotic in nature, participants were able to predict the correct side 53.1% of the time. Apparently, when it comes to seeing the future, we like to watch. Professor Bam suggests that subjects were able to sense the smut thanks to something called retroactive influence, meaning the pleasure of looking at naughty photos is so great it ripples backwards from the future to influence us in the present. That's right, folks. Science has finally discovered time traveling.
All right.
It's the flux capacitor of the rocket dome from the Nocturne.
Sorry.
I knew there was a reason.
You can see my screen again, right?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous.
Yeah. So, like, as you may have sensed from the study, like when this came out, it created a lot of controversy because a lot of people were like, well, this seems kind of impossible. Like, how could people like feel the future. But the paper has a lot of studies, you know, like I think all but one of them found significant evidence for this claim, and so the study got published. Yet, like, a lot of researchers like did not believe this finding, and it started this like attempt to reconcile how a like rigorously looking paper could still be false, or like showing something that would be impossible. And a few weeks or months later, there was like another study that showed something that was maybe even less believable. If we can go to the next slide. Right, so in this study, sorry, it seems like it's like a little bit cut out on the side. So this reads, using the same method as in study 1, we ask 20 University of Pennsylvania undergrads to listen to either When I'm 64 by the Beatles or Kalimba. Then in an ostensibly unrelated task, they indicated their birth date and their father's age. We used father's age to control for variation in baseline age across participants. And so the idea here was that listening to certain songs could make participants actually older or younger. Specifically, the idea was that listening to When I'm 64 would make participants younger. You know, I'm by now 29, approaching my 30th birthday. I'm kind of in a difficult mood. I don't know like how old all of you are. If you like would rather like to be older than younger, it might now be good to like turn away from the computer for some time, because we will actually listen to When I'm 64 for half a minute or so, which according to the study should make us like several months younger. Ian, do you want to click on the link? Yeah. I think that's enough. And if you click one further, so in this study, they found that people were not nearly a year and a half younger after listening to When I'm 64 rather than to Kalimba, and this was a statistically significant difference. So the study claims to have proven that listening to When I'm 64 actually like makes you younger compared to listening to Kalimba. And you know, like I hope that we can all agree that like this like doesn't really seem possible, you know. So like my birth date hasn't changed after listening to 30 seconds of When I'm 64. So like, you know, so how is that possible, right? And like if like research can show impossible stuff, like are these just special cases, or does it generalize like more broadly, maybe to an entire subfield or an entire field, for example, of like psychology or medicine and so on? I should note at this point, and I will talk about this in more detail, that like these three authors, Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson, created this study on purpose to show that when you do it in a certain way, you can prove anything with like scientific methods, you know, so they like did not actually like say that they would prove that when I'm 64 would make you younger. They wanted to show you exactly this, that like they can prove something that is like not possible. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So like previously we've talked about two examples where research has found something that like seems impossible. So this triggered like one of the biggest efforts, collaborative efforts in psychology, where like dozens and dozens of labs came together to estimate the reproducibility of psychological science. You can see here that it was a so-called open science collaboration. So there were really like a lot of people involved, and they replicated 100 prior studies. And as you can see on the right side here, 97 of these 100 effects from original studies were positive results that were interpreted as significant effects. So if you do some calculations and take randomness into account and the power to detect significant effects, you would expect that in a replication study, 89 of those would also show up as positive significant effects. And they found that only 35 ended up being significant in this replication effort. So like in a nutshell, like you could say that like a lot of the studies that have been published, and these were all articles that have been published in top psychology journals, that a lot of these articles we cannot replicate when we do the same study again, but collect new data with like new teams of researchers doing it. So it seems that the examples that we gave at the beginning were just the tip of the iceberg, where it's like a lot of studies in the field may not replicate. So this finally brings up to the question that I've already asked a few times, like how did we get there? Like how's this possible that it is so tricky to trust scientific findings, which we think are supposed to be reliable, robust, and consistent? Okay. So how did we end up here? Well, Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson, who did the When I'm 64 study earlier, like argue that this is a result of so-called questionable research practices. So like a bunch of things that researchers do as part of the data analysis and data collection process that helps them to detect significant effects without openly talking about them. And you know, like these are not like clearly like wrong things, like fabricating data sets, but they are like oftentimes things, you know, where you could argue that it kind of makes sense to do that. So let's look at a few examples here. Situation A, two dependent variables. Like instead of just one dependent variable, you collect two dependent variables. Like for instance, in the example of When I'm 64, you could like collect people's birth date and you could ask them for their age as numbers. Situation B, addition of 10 more observations per cell. So you like collect 20 participants, look at your results. If it's already significant, you stop. If not, you collect another 10 participants per condition. Then you check again, and maybe you collect another 10 if you feel like you're getting close to it. Situation C, sometimes, you know, like include gender as a control variable. You know, you can also interact gender with your treatment without having any specific hypothesis about it. And if any of these shows a significant effect, you will just report that significant effect. Situation D, you actually have more than 2 conditions, you have 3, but you just select the 2 where you find a significant difference and only report those. Or if you find multiple significant effects, you can also report all 3 conditions. You know, so all of these are like little tricks that you can do to, like, you know, give yourself a few more shots at finding a significant effect. And in a world where we only care about obtaining a significant effect, you know, like, that is a smart career strategy, you know. But the problem is that we usually try in research to, like, argue that our results are not due to randomness, so that we don't have so-called false positive results, right? Like, we obtain a positive result that is actually false. And we try to control this as a so-called type 1 error rate that we usually set to 5%. And what Simmons et al. Show in this study via simulations is that if you do all of these 4 techniques at once, instead of a 5% false positive rate, you bring it up to 60.7 false positive results, right? So basically, you would need to conduct the study twice to, like, have a very, very high likelihood to obtaining a significant effect in, like, at least one of these ways. And that would allow you to, like, write the paper that they did, right? So like, they're basically arguing, if you know all of these tricks, if you know all of these, like, little guidelines from the, like, handbook of, like, how to be a successful researcher, you can get anything significant and you can write about anything. So this really helps us understand how researchers can, like, prove or like provide evidence for claims that are very unlikely to be true, but also for claims that are more likely to be true, you know. And this is how it relates to the replication project. Like, a lot of these studies may have had solid theory behind it, but because we know that there are these techniques that can make anything significant, and we also know from other research that a lot of researchers engage in these techniques, that they are partly even talked at universities as, like, good techniques to, like, dig into the data. It's just very difficult to have trust into in, like, a lot of, like, a huge part of the prior body of research. So if we go to the next slide, here is a, like, write-up that is also part of the Simmons et al. Paper, where they openly respond all of the things that they did. You know, the, like, bolded parts are here what they, like, wrote at first when they wanted to present this as a solid finding, and then you see the like much more extensive description here. They collected more participants than they had originally claimed. They also had a third song, Hot Potato, which was another condition. They conducted their analysis after every session of approximately 10 participants. They, like, also collected mother's age and a bunch of other variables, and they acknowledged that without controlling for father's age, the difference that they obtained was not statistically significant. You know, so, like, if they would have been fully transparent about their results, it would have been much clearer to the reader that that the evidence was not very solid for the claim that listening to When I'm 64 would make you younger. All right, so this has been a, like, really helpful study to understand, like, how people could have done it if they wanted to obtain significant effects. And if we go to the next slide, like, we will see that, like, these have kind of been the, like, institutionalized practices for a long time. Here's the article, like, Daryl Bam, the, like, very same person who published this article about feeling the future in 1987, wrote this very influential article about like how to write an empirical journal article. So like here he really like gives his like take on like how we should write up the article. Can you click forward? And so like he writes, there are two possible articles you can write: A, the article you plan to write when you designed your study, or B, the article that makes the most sense now that you have seen the results. They are rarely the same, and the correct answer is B. You know, this has been a very influential take, that like rather than, you know, like doing hypothesis testing and predictions, publish results independent of whether they support your hypothesis or not, the answer here is very much no. You should totally like look backward, dig into the data, and then write the article as if you had always known this. Okay, can you click again? Yeah. So the conventional view of the research process, this is kind of the like philosophers of science, like a lot of like old people who have like talked about this a lot of time ago, and which is also still talked to like a lot of students. The conventional view of a research process is that we first derive a set of hypotheses from a theory, design and conduct a study to test these hypotheses, analyze the data to see if they were confirmed or disconfirmed, and then chronicle this sequence of events in the journal article. If this is how our enterprise actually proceeded, we could write most of the article before we collected the data. We could write the introduction and method sections completely, prepare the results section in skeletal form, leaving spaces to be filled in by the specific numerical results, and have two possible discussion sections ready to go. It's like kind of like fascinating to see this. Oh yeah, and it goes on to say like one for positive results, the other for negative results, but this is not how our enterprise actually proceeds. You know, it's kind of fascinating to see this many years later, because I would be like, yes, the like paragraph like is exactly how we should do it. You know, like it's like but like Bam himself goes on to say, go on a fishing expedition for something, anything interesting. Yes, there is a danger. Spurious findings can emerge by chance, and we need to be cautious about anything we discover in this way. In limited cases, there are statistical techniques that correct for this danger, but there are no statistical correctives for overlooking an important discovery because we were insufficiently attentive to the data. Let us err on the side of discovery, you know? So like Daryl Bem has a like really good awareness of like some of the problems that are involved, and an alternative view of science, or like how to do it, which would be like much more conservative, much more cautious about any kind of new problem, probably slower in discovery. And he suggests that like we should err on the side of discovery. And you know, I think this is pretty much how science has proceeded afterwards. They have erred on the side of discovery, found a lot of like cool and like fancy findings, and we have seen in the examples earlier and in our discussion of the reproducibility project where we have ended up in doing so, namely with like erring a lot on the side of discovery, you know, like to the extent that a lot of the things that we do discover do not end up being reliable, you know. And I do want to say, like please go ahead and like read this like writing the empirical journal article piece yourself, because you know, Daryl Bam like is like very smart person who like analyzes this like in like greater detail than I can like give like credit to here, if I ever want to give Ian a chance like say a few things as well, you know. So so like, I want to encourage you to, you know, like read more about this, form your own take, because as I've said, Daryl Bam has like some like quite good points here, right? Like, I mean, like new discovery is important for science as well, but I want you to be able to like, you know, like understand like how a too strong focus on like new and like ways how we can like prove things that we like find super interesting can lead us into dangerous zones. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And the last skill that I want to provide you with before Ian takes over to talk about solution is, so, or like Ian's part is going to be more about your role as a producer of knowledge, or like researcher yourself. I want to talk a little bit about like your role as a consumer of knowledge. So someone who's reading papers and who's reading papers from like, you know, decades ago and like ask themselves like, should I trust this paper? Should I believe this paper? And I like basically want to show you a few examples from like another big reproducibility project where they redid a bunch of studies, and again I think like found approximately like 40% of the studies or so that did not replicate. And my argument is that it is pretty easy to detect whether, or like at least to like have a good prediction of whether a study is going to replicate or not. So I want to give you a few seconds to like read through this description here, or I guess I will just read it out. 67 participants generated what they felt was their most important goal. They then read one of two scenarios in which a natural event was described as being a structured or random event. For example, in the structured condition, a sentence read, "The way trees produce leaves is one of the many examples of the orderly patterns created by nature." But in the random condition, the corresponding sentence read, "The way trees produce leaves is one of the many examples of the natural randomness that surrounds us." Next, participants answered 3 questions about their most important goal on a scale from 1, not very, to 7, extremely. The first item measured the subjective value of the goal, and the other 2 measured willingness to pursue that goal. Participants exposed to a structured event were more willing to pursue their goal compared with those exposed to a random event. And so like basically my advice for whenever you read a paper is to look at a combination of 2 things. One is sample size. 67 participants here assigned to 2 conditions means like 33, 34 participants per condition. That's not a lot. Like a lot of participants would be like a few hundreds or 1,000 participants. That would really like enable you to like reliably estimate the mean value in that condition. And then the other important piece of information is if the p-value is close to 0.05, because that's like boundary that traditionally scientists had to meet in order to claim that their finding is significant. And so whenever you see this combination of small sample size and a p-value of close to 0.05, I wouldn't say that like this finding has to be false. I would just be reluctant to believe it for now, you know, and like look out for other demonstrations or replication studies of it. There are 2 more examples that we have that I won't go into detail because I feel like I've already talked like a long time. But yeah, like here we have a p-value of 0.051 and like 39 degrees of freedom, which probably means that there were 40 participants in this study. So, you know, like, yeah, like be very careful when you see small sample sizes and then a like p-value that is close to 0.05. And we have one counter example of a study that has like 1,548 participants, and they don't provide p-values here, but they provide confidence intervals that are pretty far away from 0, which would be the like corresponding stat to a p-value of 0.05. So yeah, so like when you are a consumer of knowledge, closely read the methods and results parts, and pay a lot of attention to sample size and like and how strong the effect is in order to assess whether you should believe it or not. All right, Ian.
Awesome, thanks, Jan. So I think we can all agree that this is a pretty robust problem in psychology and really science more broadly. But the question has to be asked: what are we supposed to do about it? What are the solutions here? Fortunately, psychology at least has undergone a bit of a culture shift towards open science, which has given us some really useful tools to facilitate that kind of integrity. So perhaps the most widespread solution to these problems is to pre-register your research. And that's exactly what it sounds like. The standard practice now is to define your hypotheses and intended analyses before you run any participants. So basically, whatever Daryl Bem would do the opposite of it. The reason being, having a pipeline established before you have the data makes it much more difficult to swerve off the path that you've set for yourself and go fishing. As Jan was saying before, it's more difficult to introduce bias into the analyses. What this requires us to do is to branch research into exploratory or confirmatory studies. You can't use the same data to establish and test the hypothesis. That's when you start running into spurious results. So if we haven't analyzed data under the same conditions that we're hoping to, we can't really make inferences on it because we don't know exactly what we're looking at. So exploratory data offers us, that ability to at least have a semblance of an idea about what we might anticipate in a larger confirmatory sample, and from there we can make more robust inferences. So it's more of a step in that direction. And I wanted to show you what a registration report looks like with the open science framework. So I like to think of it as a paper without results. So you're defining your hypotheses and your methods, whatever analytical approach you're going to take, and results notwithstanding. Obviously, you wouldn't have numbers to fill in here, but I think the benefits to this approach are twofold. A, it gives you very clear parameters to work within. Regardless of if you're studying neuroscience or sociology or psychology or medicine, whatever it may be, you have a very clearly defined path that you're working within. And B, I think it gives you a better chance to actually define your intent of the study. It gives you perspective, and it can tell you, okay, why are we using these methods to explore this question? Like, what's unique about this study? Why are we approaching this question in this way? So I think it's a bi-directional benefit there, where it's benefiting you in the publication process as well as in the research process on top of it. So I'm going to bounce it back to Jan now just to talk briefly about reproducibility.
All right, thanks, Ian. So replicability, is an important goal. And it sets kind of a high standard, right? More or less, but you collect new data to show the same claim again. Your first claim could have just been due to randomness that you obtained that. So there was some wiggle room. Another important feature of science is reproducibility, in the sense that everyone should be able to reproduce the exact same results as researchers did in their papers. Otherwise, why would I trust it if I cannot reproduce it? I think this is an important difference because between science and other fields. For instance, now we've had a lot of discussion about the use of anonymous sources in journalism, right? So then it's kind of difficult to reproduce it when you don't know who the sources are and so on. In science, you know, like it is the strong norm that you should be able to reproduce any result that has been published, except for in some like yes, there are certain exceptions that we will talk about in a minute. But the idea is like very much, if you have access to the original data, ideally to the materials of the original data as well, so you know the kind of questionnaire that has been used, so that you know what each of the variables mean, and you have access to the code that the original authors used to analyze the data, you should be able to like do the exact same analysis and then obtain the same result. And that seems a much lower bar than replicability. However, it's also like a bar with which psychological research has struggled. So if you go to the next slide, there are guidelines. There's a code that like psychologists agree on. Here's an example from the American Psychological Association from 2001. After research results are published, psychologists do not withhold the data on which their conclusions are based from other competent professionals who seek to verify the substantive claims through reanalysis, and who intend to use such data only for that purpose, provided that the confidentiality of the participants can be protected, and unless legal rights concerning proprietary data preclude their release. So, you know, there are like a few exceptions, but a lot of research does not fall into these categories of exceptions, so that it is very much prescribed by the community of scientists, even in 2001, before this whole crisis started, that we should share like everything that is necessary to verify or reproduce results. Now, you know, like I know that I'm on this call with a bunch of psychologists and social psychologists who might have been like, is it really the norm? I mean the norm here in an like injunctive sense, whereas I'm definitely not saying that it is the descriptive norm, because if we go to the next slide, there has been a paper by Jelte Wichertz and others where they find that or where they seeked out to reproduce and verify studies, and they write, the origin of the present comment lies in a failed attempt to obtain through emailed requests data reported in 141 empirical articles recently published by APA. Our original aim was to reanalyze these data sets to assess the robustness of the research findings to outliers. We never got that far, you know. So even though it is prescribed to share the data, like when you try to do that, and maybe some of you have already tried to do that, you got intrigued by a research article and you were like, well, I would like to just like, you know, like check this myself, or I would like to do something slightly different with it, but my first step would be to replicate this or like reproduce this finding in order to like make sure that I fully understand what the authors were doing. You may have like sent out emails to like get access and have never received a response, or like have received a response that said, unfortunately, I can't share the data because I don't have it anymore, you know? So this is very much what like this team of researchers found. So if we go to the next slide, they found that in 11% of these 141 articles, the data was shared after the first request. So that is pretty much what like is prescribed to be done. 16, like an additional 16% of the cases, the data was shared after reminders. You know, so people are busy, sure, you know, like maybe they like forgot about an email, but together this is only 27%, right? So then there were like 20% of researchers who like did not share the data despite promising so, 14% just never replied, 4% had undeliverable email, and 35% refused or were unable to share the data, you know. So overall, like roughly, or like a little bit more than a quarter, were able to provide the necessary files to reproduce a finding, you know. So this is like a real hit to the scientific system as it is supposed to work, because it like, you know, these were already like people had to reach out in order to access the data, right? It was not that they could just like go out and find it on the internet. They already like invested effort into trying to access the data, and still they were only able to do so for like a quarter of the findings. So for the others, 75%, right? Like there might have been errors in it. There like might have been, you know, like all other possible things that like, you know, would like undermine the validity of the research, and we will just not be able to ever check that. And if we go to the next slide, so I did my master's at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, which a few years before I attended that school had a big scandal of one of the psychology professors admitting to having fabricated data for a lot of studies over a lot of years. And when a committee looked into like how the fabrication was done, it was not that it was a very sophisticated data falsification. It was just that like due to common norms, like no one had really checked it. You know, like if people would have had access to all of the data sets, as like some students eventually did, they were like, well, there were like a lot of like rows being copy pasted here. It's kind of weird that we would have the same participant over and over again. This seems kind of weird, you know, like that was not like elaborate algorithms to like identify fabricated data sets. So even the like cases of data fabrication that would be very easy to detect could go unnoticed for like a long time due to the total lack of openness and transparency that was very widespread in science. I say was, you know, because I think like this has changed since then, and like journals do require now quite often that you make your data openly accessible, or at least they will reward you with you know, like a badge or so for doing so. So I will let Ian talk about potential solutions for you as a researcher, how you can make sure that your own research is reproducible.
Awesome, thanks, Jan. Yeah, so I think that's a really great outline of the problem and kind of the opaque nature of science as it's been. I just want to talk about a couple of solutions. So Jan mentioned publishing open data as well as using open software, which are two things I'm very adamant about. So let's dive in. So like Jan mentioned, I mean, one aspect of a potential solution to this problem is the ability to replicate, verify, and check robustness. If we can't do those things, we really don't stand a chance of knowing you know, what percentage of these results are valid and which percentage were perhaps you know, spurious. So making data available for other researchers to analyze is a really important tenet of open science, especially when combined with the pre-registration process that I mentioned a few minutes ago. You know, taken together, those analyses that you list in your registration report, as well as with your open data, that makes it very easy for other researchers to see A, exactly what you did, and B, attempt to do it themselves. And you know, I want to make the point as well, since folks come into academic research with really different backgrounds, you know, and different approaches to solving problems, it's often useful to have your findings cross-validated. They could possibly even be interpreted differently. They might find nuance in your data that you didn't think to look for the first time. So, there shouldn't be a lack of willingness to share data, because it can really only, produce good results if you're on the up and up with your analyses. Now, in regards to hosting open data, there are a lot of options. Like Jan mentioned, I mean, confidentiality is a big problem, especially with participant data for younger populations or at-risk populations. So you need something with a really secure backend that's robust to security breaches. I'm going to talk about two today: GitHub and the Open Science Framework. We've mentioned OSF briefly already. So GitHub is really more of a code sharing resource than a data sharing resource, but I wanted to mention it because you can accomplish both, and because it is very robust to code sharing. So just a little bit about GitHub and the underlying language. I guess you could call it a language. It's more of a framework. Git. It's a version control resource. So I think of it almost like G Suite, Google Docs and Google Slides, etc., but for code instead of for documentation. So multiple people can work on the same project simultaneously. And what Git does is automatically tracks your changes. So, down the road, so you're working on a project with a couple collaborators, and you've all landed on a different solution. Well, you have the option to merge whichever one you've all agreed on, or to come up with a compromise between them. So that's at your discretion. We'll talk about the coding aspect of this in a few minutes, but in terms of approaching open data with GitHub, it is a pretty good option. It's robust to CSVs and things like that. You can host those there. So OSF, on the other hand, is really more of a one-stop shop for research materials. So you're able to store data, stimuli, code, manuscripts, presentation slides, really anything that is even tangentially related to your research from its inception to the time that you publish, and even after, if you're doing follow-up analyses. You can host all of those in an open science, they call them repositories, but that's like a fancy word for a folder. And the other benefit to this is once you make an account, say I make an account and I'm working with Jan on a project, and then I go to work with another person, I don't have to make separate accounts for each one. All my projects are linked back to me. So you have easy access to everything you've ever done, basically academically, and it's easily shareable and transferable. So I'm not going to formally poll the group here, but I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, were trained in statistical inference using some kind of software like SPSS or Stata. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this lecture today, it is to stop using SPSS and Stata. And thank you very much for coming. That is all the information I have for you. No, I'm just kidding. In actuality, there are a lot of good reasons to transition away from using these software packages. Because a major component of open science is freely available software or open software. So when you download a language like Python or R, you actually don't need to log into it. You just need to have it on your machine and you can start using it. Versus something like SPSS or Stata that requires a license and activation and sometimes annual payments. The university pays for it sometimes. Lots to discuss there. So let's dive into SPSS specifically. So like I mentioned, I mean, most, if not all of us, have probably used SPSS in an academic setting already. So the idea that we shouldn't be using this type of software might be confusing. You might wonder, why was I trained on something that's not a good practice? There are lots of reasons why universities still use SPSS, but I'm going to offer some compelling reasons why they shouldn't be. So for one, these software are, I refer to them as black box software packages. So let's say that you're running an analysis, everything's looking really great, you got robust results that you're happy with, and you want to share a table or a figure to demonstrate what you found. Well, the problem there is that there's no record really of what you've done. You end up with output with virtually no input. The problem being then, if somebody wants to replicate your research, it's relying solely on you remembering you know, what tests you ran, what settings you had plugged into the software, you know, how your data looked at the time that you ran that, if it was long or wide, I mean. So that poses a really big problem, because if you're not 100% meticulous in your documentation, then your research won't be replicable, and it'll suffer as a result. And the other really big reason is the proprietary nature of these software packages. First and foremost, there are massive ethical considerations to putting science behind a paywall. I'm going to cover that, you know, briefly for the sake of time, but that's a whole discussion in itself. You know, if you can't afford a license for SPSS, that shouldn't preclude you from engaging in science or academic work in general. So, you know, paying for science is not open science. That's exclusionary. And functionally speaking, tools like Python or R are very bottom up. So they're community oriented. In other words, new tools, packages, and updates come from the users themselves. So people actually using those languages on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to, you know, IBM has come up with an update, and so your SPSS version has updated. Not to say that they, you know, don't have your best interest in mind, but, you know, say you're working with somebody in R and they come up with a really slick package that you want to use, they're easily shareable. You can very quickly use somebody else's code to accomplish tasks that you want to and analyses that you want to. So we're going to talk about, I've mentioned these a couple times. I just want to touch on them a little more in detail, just so we're all on the same page. And those languages are R and Python. So R is widely used to conduct data analysis. Everything from political science to economics to social psychology to sociology. It's very robust to data analysis and modular in that domain. It's built for statisticians by statisticians. So it's not really what you'd call like a computer science or a general purpose language. You wouldn't build an application in R, but you can use it for statistics and data analysis widely, and it's by far the best language for that, in my own opinion. And right out of the box, right when you download R, it has a pretty wide range of statistical tools built in to facilitate analyses you're probably familiar with, like linear modeling, t-tests, ANOVA, et cetera. And you can take those functions and expand them using libraries, which are pre-written collections of code that really do much of the heavy lifting for you. So you're not necessarily having to write a ton of code yourself. You can just import a library and use a function that's built in there. The tidyverse, which is, these are just a few of the packages in the tidyverse in that bottom right corner. But that's a collection of libraries solely intended to make your code more readable and easier to write. And that's a really big deal, because any tool that's designed solely for the sake of ease, I think is you know, a massive tool to have in your toolbox. And going with that, you know, R is really rooted in community. Since it's used so heavily in academia, it tends to foster much less of a competitive environment than other languages like Python or Java or C. Those languages tend to get very who knows the most very fast. And I feel like I've had less of that experience in R, at least. And it's just very, very transparent, very welcoming. The community is, I think, a massive part of what makes R special. And in contrast, Python, really a different beast in its entirety. It's much closer in function to a high-level language like Java, C, C#, et cetera. But it's written using minimal syntax, much like R. And while statistics isn't really Python's bread and butter, the trade-off is that you can program just about anything you want in Python. Say you're doing a study where you're showing participants stimuli, you can generate the stimuli in Python, program the presentation script in a package called scipy, analyze the data, and plot your findings with the robust graphic packages that Python has. So, you know, while it's not primarily a statistical language, it has all the statistical power you could want. It just takes a little more runway to get there. Whereas R, most of those functions are built in. In Python, you have to do a couple imports, and you know, there's different naming conventions and things like that. that go into Python that R doesn't have to deal with. So I would say, broadly speaking, learning Python long-term might be good if you're less interested in academic work. Well, let me skip to this slide. If you're more interested in something like user experience engineering or machine learning, Python might be a little more flexible. But if you're really driving towards something that's more heavily reliant on statistics, even if it's not 100% academic, say working for a corporation doing data analysis, political polling, et cetera, R is absolutely going to get the job done for you. But my long-term kind of like broad takeaway here for you is that both of these are better options than SPSS or Stata, just from a transparency standpoint. We were talking about GitHub earlier. You can write a script in R and share it on GitHub, and everybody can see exactly what you did. And the same with Python. So these are features of programming languages that kind of black box software packages do not have, and all of that facilitates open science. And I think we have a question, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, asking for your thoughts on MATLAB.
My personal thoughts on MATLAB, I don't really have any because I've never had to use it. So depending on what you're doing, if you're neuroimaging or doing some kind of fMRI analysis or EEG, there are lots of packages in Python that can take care of that for you. MATLAB, I think, is, what's the right way to put it? MATLAB exists in academia to the point that it does just because it's so widely used in cognitive neuroscience. And to a point, I think there's a level of comfort there where you're not so much worried about porting all of your functions and all of the scripts that you've done through your PhD and through your dissertation and through your postdoc. Like porting all those over to something like Python is possibly more trouble than it's worth. And really, I guess my larger takeaway here is that the pre-registration process takes a little weight off this that concern. Because if you already have everything documented in your pre-registration and it checks out with what you've done in MATLAB or SPSS or Stata, then there's a little less room for error or bias, I would say. Versus, that's not to say that if you're using Python or R, you shouldn't be rigorous in your pre-registration process. But I would say that the hierarchy of things to worry about is first making sure that your analyses are well defined if you're going to use a software package like MATLAB or SPSS or Stata. And that's just for the sake of not always being able to share your code the same way. Although MATLAB is a little more script based, so that's maybe a little less relevant than SPSS to my point. But yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. And I'm going to bounce it back to Jan for talks about accessibility.
Yeah. So I think the first 2 points, of replicability, reproducibility, are kind of a bit more complex and more specific to scientists and researchers, I guess. The last point is really a core belief of that science should be accessible, not just for all researchers, but really for everyone, right? What we do is try to generate and accumulate knowledge that is hopefully true. And for that, the other 2 principles are very important, I think. But we are trying to generate that, or at least I am. People may also have different opinions on that, but to provide useful knowledge for societies, for the for the world as a whole, so that hopefully people can benefit from it and their well-being is improved. And sometimes that takes a long time, but if research is not accessible to everyone out there, it's really what are we doing this for? So you may, however, encounter quite often paywalls, right? And I think like this is true. And if we go to the next slide, like for like journalist articles, but also for science articles, like depending on at which institution you are, maybe you are at your parents' place at the moment, or you just live off campus and you don't have a connection to a university network at the moment, then in particular, you cannot access a lot of the research articles out there, right? And if you were ever desperate enough to try to like find out how expensive it would be to like read an article or read an entire issue or volume of a journal, if we go to the next slide, it's like it's pretty expensive, like especially if you would have to pay for multiple journals or multiple issues. Already buying books for classes is oftentimes like super expensive. And like a lot of us are, and when I say us, I mean like a lot of research is like funded by the public, oftentimes supported by taxpayers' money. Like this should really be like readable for everyone who wants to learn about science. And more specifically, like if you are a researcher yourself, as many of you may aspire to be, you need access to a lot of journals in order to be able to write the best possible paper yourself, right? You need to be aware of the literature. And right now, Ian and I are at like in a pretty lucky situation where we are at Stanford, where the university does provide us with like access to most journals out there. But researchers at other universities in the US, or also like in like other countries, do not have access to like all of the journals that they would like to read. So there's a big inequality there in terms of like career opportunities as well, not just in simple like access to knowledge. And it has been shown that scientific knowledge is not super accessible. If you go to the next slide, like here's an like overview, and the gray bars are illustrates the like percentage of articles that is not accessible for everyone. That's usually the majority in most fields. And psychology and the social sciences are rather at the like lower bottom of it, even though like a lot of us feel like we have important things to say that we would like more people to read. So it would be great if we could extend this, and it is actually pretty easy to do. If we go to the next slide, like the straightforward way to provide access to any kind of paper that you write is to post it on a so-called preprint server. In this way, you provide like open access to your article, which is the term that like has been used a lot in the like open science domain. So it's really straightforward. You go to SciArchive, you click on submit a preprint, and then you have to provide a little bit of information. But after you have written your paper, it's usually like it may take you like 5 minutes or so to like do this. So it's like very straightforward to do, and afterwards everyone can read your paper, which is not in the polished like journal format. It doesn't look as nice. It's in the like raw format that you've uploaded, but like everyone can read it, everyone can cite it, independent of whether the like reader is like another researcher at your university, another researcher at a different university, or just a person, you know, like who wants to educate themselves on the topic that you have been studying. So like posting your paper every time that you submit to a journal, as well on a preprint server, or like update it if you send it to like different journals and you have worked on it in the meantime, it's a very easy step for you in order to make sure that scientific knowledge becomes more accessible. The only thing that you have to take care of here is, if we go to the next slide, is that, you know, some journals may not like it because they make their money based on subscriptions, or at least partly based on subscriptions. So you should check the journal's policies before submission, and you can do this via this Sherpa Romeo website. Most journals like won't mind if you post a version of your article on a preprint server or on your own website. You know, you can even oftentimes like upload the final version of like even the like journal article, at least on your personal website, which is another way to make it accessible. But there you have to like more closely read whatever your agreement you signed with the journal. But I would highly encourage you, you know, to like dig a little bit deeper into this, and whenever you can, post your paper on preprint servers, and use preprint servers to like find and read articles yourself when you're looking for them, and maybe you cannot like access them on the journal's website. Like Google Scholar and Archive are very well integrated, so that it will oftentimes send you to Archive if you just like type in the title of the paper in Google Scholar. All right, that was the last take from me, from us. I hope that you got insights into like the like core fundamental principles of open science. I hope we have not like depressed you too much with our take on science. I would emphasize that, you know, like we still like are strong believers in that like science has like something important to like contribute, and we are just very motivated on like improving the process to make it more replicable, more reproducible, and more accessible for everyone out there. Yeah, and Ian, I guess we should just open it up for questions now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, the Q&A is wide open, so please feel free. Yeah, and like Jan said, I mean, this isn't you know, to judge science per se. It's more a love for science and what science can be that we're striving for these changes. So yeah, I hope that was useful and beneficial.